Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about some obscure Oscar Wilde recommendations. And by obscure I don't mean super obscure, because Oscar Wilde is a very popular and very well-known writer, so none of his works are really obscure. But really this is a kind of a follow-up of a video I did a few months ago, which was all about where to start with Oscar Wilde, and I'm going to link that video in the description box. So if you haven't seen that yet, then I recommend you watch that first. And in that video I talk about, as the title says, where I think you should start with Oscar Wilde if you haven't read any of his works yet. So this video is about what to read next, really. Some of my personal favourites in Oscar Wilde's opus, and some of his works that aren't talked about so much. Now, the really obvious place to go to for this is Oscar Wilde's plays. The Importance of Being Earnest is possibly his most well-known play, but he actually has quite a few more comedies in the same kind of vein, comedies that discuss issues of society. There's usually some sort of hidden secret or dark past that is uncovered in the plays. I'm not going to go into any detail about those plays because only recently Marissa from Blatantly Bookish has uploaded a wonderful video about exactly that. So I'm going to link that in the description box as well. If you want to know any more about Wilde's comedic plays, then check that out. But the plays are definitely the works you want to explore if you have only read one or two of Oscar Wilde's works, because in his plays the thing we love about Oscar Wilde, his wonderful ability with words, his incredibly witty sense of humour, and his ability to depict the kind of darkness within people in a very light-hearted way, really shines, and his plays are a delight to read, and they're even more fun to actually see. So I would also recommend that you check out adaptations of those plays if you don't have the chance to see them on stage, and let's be honest, most of us won't have the chance to see them on stage whenever we wish. But definitely give those adaptations a go, or read the plays themselves if you want to discover more of that side of Oscar Wilde's writing. My personal favourite is The Importance of Being Earnest, but other than that I really like A Woman of No Importance, and I also really like An Ideal Husband. As well as Oscar Wilde's plays, I also really enjoy his short stories, and they aren't really talked about quite as much. I would recommend that you start with a collection called Lord Arthur Savile's Crime and Other Stories, and that is a collection of, I believe, 4 or 5 of his short stories, but I want to talk about 2 in particular. First one is the titular story, Lord Arthur Savile's Crime, which is very interesting if you have read The Picture of Dorian Gray, because it touches on a lot of the same themes. Some of the characters even have the same name, and I wouldn't be surprised if The Picture of Dorian Gray sprang out of the idea that he turned into the short story Lord Arthur Savile's Crime. Let me just tell you a little bit about the setup. So Lord Arthur Savile is a young, beautiful, sort of rich man who has nothing to do, and his only dream is to get married to the beautiful Savile. Except one day at a party, what's the word? Can't remember the word. Someone who reads hands, so a soothsayer, well, someone who reads hands and then predicts the future based on that, tells him that there is actually murder in his future. So then Lord Arthur tries very hard to commit that murder so that he can then get married to the beautiful Savile. And that is the setup of the story. And what follows is very typical of Oscar Wilde's writing. It's quite funny, it's quite tragic, and it really explores the themes of destiny and truth that are also very prevalent in his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. So if you're a fan of Dorian Gray, then definitely check out the short story Lord Arthur Savile's Crime. But my favourite story in this collection is actually called The Canterville Ghost. And this is just a lovely, funny, adorable story of an American family who moved to England and buy or rent, I can't quite remember, I think they rent an ancient haunted Elizabethan manor house. They are warned upon their arrival that the house is haunted, and they are fine with that. Being pragmatic Americans, they then proceed to have various conflicts with the ghost, and it's a really funny story. It's a very light-hearted in a way story. It's the sort of story that you could tell a child. It's not very, convoluted and dark, even though this being Oscar Wilde, there is some aspects of darkness in this as well. What I love about this short story is that it is a culture clash narrative, and I really enjoy culture clash narratives, but I enjoy them the most when they poke fun at both cultures that are clashing. So obviously, this being Oscar Wilde, he pokes fun at the Americans. They barge into this old haunted house that has a blood stain on the carpet in the sitting room, and the pragmatic son just whips out some American cleaning potion and just cleans it off. It really contrasts the kind of English sense of pathos with the American no-nonsense kind of attitude, but it also pokes fun at the English sense of pathos because the ghost himself is also a character in this, and we get to experience part of the story through his perspective, and he is absolutely dismayed at these loud, horrible Americans coming in and destroying his home and not appreciating what he considers his performances, him rattling the chains, and then they come and suggest that he oils them. It's that kind of narrative, and I really, really like that. And it's like many of Oscar Wilde's tales and story, this starts off being really hilariously funny and then goes into a rather cheesy, rather dramatic, rather super natural, moralistic kind of direction. If you've ever read any of his stories or tales, then you'll know what I mean. But I highly recommend The Canterville Ghost if you want to read a slightly spooky but mostly funny culture clash narrative between an American family and a ghost. Then there's also his fairy tales. Oscar Wilde published 2 collections of fairy tales. One of them is called The Happy Prince and Other Tales, and the other one's called The Pomegranate House. And I personally really like The Happy Prince and Other Tales. I'm not a huge fan of the second collection. In The Happy Prince and Other Tales, he takes the archetypes and stereotypes and kind of story structures of a traditional fairy tale, but makes them kind of his own. So this is what is commonly known as an art tale or an art fairy tale. And I'm just going to tell you a bit about 2 of my favourite stories from that collection so you get a feel for what kind of things these tales are about. My absolute favourite is called The Remarkable Rocket, and this tale is told from the perspective of a firework rocket which is sitting in a box waiting to be set off at I think it's the marriage of the prince and a princess. So you get kind of that chord setting that we know from fairy tales, except it's not really about the prince and the princess. It's mostly about this firework rocket, and this firework rocket has a big ego problem. So he goes on and on about how he's the most remarkable rocket, how everyone's going to be looking at him and admiring him, and then things go wrong. So that's my favourite. My second favourite is a tale called The Nightingale and the Rose, and that one's a lot more dramatic, has a lot more pathos, has a lot more heartbreak, and a lot more of that kind of over-the-top morality that I do kind of love about Oscar Wilde, despite its cheesiness. So The Nightingale and the Rose is the story of a student who is in love with this woman, and she tells him to bring him the reddest rose, except there aren't any red roses. So the little nightingale hears his complaints and wants to help him, and that's where I'm going to leave the story before I spoiler the ending. Another lovely story is The Selfish Giant, which is a lot more like a traditional children's fairy tale, I would say. And again, there's kind of the moral aspect to it. I find those stories quite Catholic in their nature, even though I know that Oscar Wilde wasn't a Catholic, though I believe he did convert in the last days of his life. But, you know, it's a very Christian kind of morality, but all linked in with this fairy tale setting and some societal commentary. I really hope this makes sense. If you don't fancy exploring short stories and fairy tales and plays, then have a look at his poems. And I'm really not the right person to talk about poetry because I personally don't appreciate poetry all that much. I prefer a good story with a plot, but Oscar Wilde did write one poem that has a good story with a plot, and that is the Ballad of Reading Gaol. And like all ballads, you know, this is a narrative poem. I would recommend that you watch a YouTube video of the actor Rupert Everett reading out this poem. I will link that down below. It's, you know, you don't have to buy the poem and read it, just listen to him recite it, because he does it in a really beautiful way. Obviously, Oscar Wilde spent 2 years in Reading Gaol, which, by the way, is in the process of being demolished, I believe, because it's been bought up by someone, and I think it's going to be converted into flats or something like that. Well, that's what happens to historic buildings here when money is short. In jail, I believe, is when he wrote the story about another prisoner who was hanged at the jail for killing his wife. So this is the story of this prisoner, and I find it very beautiful. But again, I don't know anything about poetry, so don't take my word for it. Listen to the poem yourself, or read it if you prefer, and tell me what you think after that. And finally, there's also Oscar Wilde's essays, and they are a lot more abstract in nature. Although some of his short stories I think you can also consider essays. There is one story called The Portrait of Mr W.H, which is basically a narrative essay in which Wilde explores a popular theory about who the dedications of Shakespeare's sonnets were for. Weird story. That was actually the first Oscar Wilde I ever read, and would not recommend starting with that. But that is an interesting way of disseminating this popular theory, which even in the work itself is not treated as the absolute truth, by making characters discuss it. But he also wrote quite a few more traditional essays about issues of mostly class and aesthetics and philosophy. Once you've read all of the other things, you might want to turn your attention to those non-fiction essays. What I wanted to achieve with this video is to tell you that there's a lot more to Oscar Wilde than just the Picture of Dorian Gray and his comedic plays, even though they are wonderful, especially the plays, but his work is actually quite varied in nature. So let me know which of Oscar Wilde's more obscure works you have read and enjoyed or not enjoyed, and which ones intrigue you and you want to read next. Being a huge Oscar Wilde fan as I am, I would also recommend that you just get a collection of his complete works and read that start to finish, although the poems he wrote in his youth are kind of terrible. Thank you for watching. Bye.